The more things change, the more things stay the same. This was 50 years ago. Where are we today? We could argue that in all sorts of ways things are different now. We, in fact, are under constant surveillance, whether we like it or not, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, with whom we're doing it, and so forth. Everything is connected in an incredible number of ways, not just the fact that we've connected into the free Wi-Fi here in the auditorium, but if you look at the devices, they are promiscuous. They have 3, 4, 5 ways of connecting to the outside world just in case the other ones don't work or you've turned them off. And then we have the quite famous stories of Edward Snowden, which basically said, well, government's getting in on the act too, in ways that were controversial and that are controversial. So I come back to it. Have things changed or have they not? What I want to go through in this presentation is a bit of a lilt of, yes, things have changed a lot, haven't they? Well, actually, they haven't so much, have they? And then come out to quite an optimistic end to try and suggest that there is something that we can and should be and will be doing about it. The first thing to do is to think about our data. What is it? Data, if nothing else, is a massive asset. Do this thought experiment. Tomorrow, the accounting societies deem that information has to be brought onto the balance sheet as an asset, valued, managed, value extracted from it. You would find that a very large number of companies and even government organisations in this world would discover that data was by far the largest valued asset on their books. Right now it's not, in most cases. And in fact, companies are de-assetifying themselves in all other ways. They don't own their buildings, their staff are on labour hire, all the technology is on lease. So not only is the data asset going up, but all the other assets are coming down. There will be companies on this planet already whose only asset is information. And yet the accounting societies haven't caught up. Data is an asset in its practical use. When a few of us were at the International Data Protection Commissioners Conference last year, there were the people from the GSMA Association telling us how much more use could have been made of mobile phone usage data, not the contents of the calls, just the usage data, for understanding the way the Ebola virus was evolving and moving around in the communities in Africa. And there are a whole series of reasons it's given as to why that couldn't be done, of which privacy was one argument in a fairly naive way. My point is there's data out there with some incredibly valuable uses. There's this one. When we made this slide deck a couple of weeks ago and were drawing it up, and we were researching Uber, at that point the valuation of Uber was about $41 billion US dollars. I've already got that one wrong. They now think it's up to $50 billion valuation. It's just scooting away. It's just an app exchanging data. There happen to be a lot of people looking at and using that data, but boy, what a business. I didn't think of that one, damn it. Genomics, understanding the DNA sequence in your body and my body. It's only a decade or so back that it cost billions of dollars to do the first end-to-end human genome sequence. We can now sequence the relevant parts, at least, of an individual's genome for $1,000, and it's going to be down to $100 pretty shortly. Just before I left Australia, I was watching an interview on one of the television stations that was saying every baby's genome ought to be sequenced at birth. We're already doing the heel prick on babies to understand certain characteristics, in particular for phenylketonuria and various other tests on babies. Graham Innes, for example, who was our Disability Commissioner in Australia for a long time, was blind. But why was he blind? He was born with vision. He was fed eggs, and he had inability to digest one part of the protein. That's phenylketonuria. He went blind. if they knew that he suffered from that genetic disability at birth, he would not be blind. And now there's any number of stories like that that we can tell. So shall we just sequence all of the babies as they are born and that's it? We know and have a predestiny for everybody? How many people have watched Gattaca as a movie? We can get it right and we can get it wrong. And then there's the connected city. It's just another wonderful use of data where we can actually massively improve the handling of transport problems. And Auckland, just to pick a city at random, has transport problems. You know, how much of that can be managed by smarter use of the data about how traffic moves, who goes from where to where, when and why, and then manage it through other mechanisms than building more roads or other infrastructure. We're seeing enormous revolutions happening in cities as a result of being able to understand transport data alone, let alone anything else. One of the things that National ICT Australia has done is it's looked at the history of the behaviour of large water pipes in Sydney. From that analysis, it's able to predict when the next water main will burst and hence put in place an intervention. Enormous value from data as an asset. But of course there's data as a liability, and the most obvious one is this, you know, the enormous hacks. The first time I saw 100 million records compromised by a particular data loss, it seemed to be astounding and a one-off, and it would never happen again. It seems to be actually happening at the rate of about once per year, at the rate of one loss, 100 million records gone. Now this is vast. We're compromising the records relating to Americans at the rate of 1/3 of the population every year. Now, you know, New Zealand has got to be better than the Americans, got to be twice as good as the Americans. That actually means we're losing data relating to New Zealanders for 1/6 of the population every year. That's just a guess. We have this one here. Our Privacy Commissioner mentioned where Target was using information in a way that it knew that it was using and reaching conclusions that were surprising. Here is where it got misused and the CEO had to resign because it got hacked. How did it get hacked, by the way? A system called HVAC was hacked. Outsourced service provider providing heating, ventilating and air conditioning, remotely controlled by the outsourced service provider. The hacker hacked the HVAC service provider, which allowed them to hack back into Target and then exfiltrate the data. And on top of that, the warning systems in Target knew when the exfiltration date was going to happen. So it was a system built to accumulate the data and then exfiltrate it all out suddenly. The system knew that. They didn't believe it was going to happen. So they nearly got it right and they got it dreadfully wrong. We have this one here, which is quite sad in a way, because this is our Department of Immigration that protects the lives of 1/4 of our population, because 1/4 of them were not born in Australia. About a year ago, information relating to 10,000 refugees was made publicly available through poor coding of a website, which investigation shows was due to poor governance and training within the organisation. In other words, proximal cause, human error; system cause, very poor controls. This was the same problem a year later. Data about those 20 G20 leaders was posted and available online through poor website coding. This is moving from bad accident to systemic failure in a department that has data about some of the most exposed people in Australia. Not good enough, guys. One of the things that we can celebrate, though, is when I was in New Zealand last for this conference, I think it was 2012, and we were going through a pretty exciting period here. Like, for example, we had a series of wake-up calls. Accident Compensation Corporation slammed. NZ Ministry, that was Works and Income, knew of a massive data breach. We have this one here. The Earthquake Commission had a bit of an oops, probably not as bad as some of the oopses, but it still caused a lot of excitement. And blow me, Inland Revenue went and suffered as well. Yes, the Commissioner at the time said, this appears to have been the year of the data breach. It was quite a wake-up call to New Zealand. What was quite interesting about that series of events was very little of it was hack. It was accident. Things went wrong rather than aggressive attack. Just imagine if you were subjected in your government agencies to aggressive attack in that circumstance. And the best thing the banks and the big health service providers and others could do was to curl up into the fetal position under the desk and say, thank goodness it's government that's in the spotlight. Because there's not always evidence that the other economic sectors are doing a lot better. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But look how things have changed as well. ACC went through the independent review, of which our company was one of the independent reviewers, and has begun to turn things around, at least in terms of what's actually happening in the corporation. Even if public perceptions, as they always do, lag that, the facts of the matter are the corporation is a different corporation from what it was before. We have in our audience a person who didn't have a job, or this job at least at the time, because we now have one, and he's called the Government Chief Privacy Officer. We've had another review by the Law Commission and a government undertaking to implement the Law Commission's report. And we have this incredibly exciting thing that I think New Zealand, it's one of the things New Zealand is best at, is operating at that one level of government, tight community, 4 million people, a unique opportunity in things such as the Data Futures Forum, where they're exploring how can we use, at least at this point, government data, including administrative data, for other purposes than originally collected. And they've got 4 values up there. We must extract value. It must be inclusive in the way that it's done. It must involve deep trust in the community, and people must have a sense of control where that's relevant. And that is one of the things about New Zealand. The different populations of people in New Zealand will have varying levels of trust in government. And we must remember that there will be parts of any population, including the population here, who either have actual reason not to trust their government because they've been stuffed around in some way, or mistakes have been made, or some government official is picking on them, or because they have damn good reason not to trust government because government hasn't found them to be very trustworthy either in various ways. But we still have to have trust, we still have to give people control where we want to, and by and large, this is a community here in New Zealand that has higher levels of trust in its community and in the people who run the government than many, many, many other countries of the world, and you're taking advantage of it. One of the bits that we found interesting in looking into the report was this 4-way quadrant, which above the horizontal line is where you're using data to target people, and below the line is where you're using data for non-targeted activity. For example, traffic management, observation and control might be in the bottom quadrant. And on the left-hand side, it's where there's collective decision-making, and on the right-hand side, it's where individuals get a go. That allows you for some quite good analytics on what should be the governance and accountability arrangements that are in place accordingly. So top left-hand corner, for example, is where you may have the corrections people. Son, you got no choice, but you're going to jail tomorrow, or we're going to pick you up and we're going to put you through a whole set of police checks and then arrest and then taking you through the courts. There's not a lot of control of the personal information in those circumstances. The tax office has quite a lot of, Inland Revenue's got quite a lot of opportunities to simply go and get, and you don't have much opportunity to say no. But if you're in that quadrant, then the accountabilities and governance arrangements that sit on you have to appropriately match that. So it's quite a useful analytic. By the way, in these set of slides, wherever you see something in blue like that, that's actually a clickable link. We will be publishing this web presentation on the company website, iispartners.com. That was the brochure you pulled out of your bag to see if you won a prize. Or I believe we're going to also have a lot of very rich materials available on the website for this conference as well for you to click on. So it's well worth going back and having a look if you want to. Here's another a set of things that I think come out of the Data Futures Forum. To what extent is the thinking that's being done in the Data Futures Forum applicable to private sector use of private sector data? But a slightly more grey question is this: where is the fastest growing collection and availability of data coming from? It's not from government, it's in the private sector. government at some stage cannot avoid making use of that private sector collected and used data. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, because that depends on how you do it. I'm saying it's a fact. It's going to happen. And some of it's going to be by purchase. You know, you buy into a data set, and some of it's going to be by compulsion. Sorry guys, we're having that. And that's what the metadata retention law in Australia is all about, creating a concentrated set of telecommunications metadata for access by government officials in the right circumstances. But I think we need to think about, is there something in the Data Futures Forum that can be applied elsewhere? I think there's an outstanding question, though, in the Data Futures Forum that still needs a lot of work, and if we did the same thing in Australia or in the USA or the UK or the non-English speaking countries, which is this one: who decides and who ensures what decisions are, and are they followed? Because I would suggest in the Data Futures Forum at the moment, there's a fair bit of, trust me, I'm from the government. And there are actually quite good reasons for doing it. We've been doing some work with Statistics New Zealand, which is, you know, heavily involved in this process. And you can make an argument that the law, as well as the ethos of Stats New Zealand, makes them a quite worthy, trustworthy body. You know, it's a reasonable bet to place your trust in Stats New Zealand, because they've got a century of behaving themselves. You know, things might go wrong, but their ethos is right, and they're doing quite a lot about understanding statistically what they're doing. That's their profession. They do good work in trying to make sure their systems are controlled. Nothing's perfect, but it's better than some of the others, you could argue. But is that enough when it comes to not just the collection and analytics of the data in some of the Data Futures Forum, but then the use of those insights by others? And I don't think you can parcel that up and say, we're just doing the research. We give the research to the policy people, and then the people in the street actually apply it. Somebody, and it's called a government, has to think end to end on who makes those decisions. Will we proceed? How will we make sure it's done right? Oh, sorry, who did that? That was me. Sorry about that. Where we're headed to. So I've done a little bit of where we've been and where we are, and in particular New Zealand, and some of the rapid evolution that's happened. I mean, the way New Zealand government is going about doing privacy, I think, has changed quite a lot in the last couple of years, even if there might be more to do. Now, here's a bit of the future, Internet of Things. You know, our shopping is incredibly connected, and, you know, all the things that we can buy now that have got one way or another a contact with the network. The smart home is going to get incredibly smarter very shortly, and it's not just going to be the smart meters on electricity and gas and water and everything else. It's going to be all the thingies within the home collecting and radiating data, basically unless you tell it not to, because these are going to be on by default, not off by default. Then you've got another quite interesting one, which is just the way you run a business or an industry anymore using data, including agriculture. The revolution on the farm that comes from the Internet of Things that's already happening in terms of when do you water, when do you fertilise, when do you reap, and everything else is just amazing. It's happened already. The smart car. Think of this one. How's the court case going to go when the first smart car that is driverless kills somebody? No, runs over a pedestrian. What about this one, when the smart car has to decide whether it will kill the granny crossing the road or the kids inside the car? But it has the choice of only one of those two things. It can't do the third thing, which is save everybody. Now, these are ethical decisions that are going to have to be made by somebody who programs that car to make that decision. Who is going to be held liable in these circumstances? And the wearables of all sorts. And as John Edwards, the Privacy Commissioner, said earlier on, you know, it's going into the clothes, it's going to go into the labels and so forth. We haven't even started, and beyond the Internet of Things is going to be the Internet of Invisibles. We can already basically do smart dust, and apparently with smart dust, all it does is radiate a naught or a one. But if you've got enough noughts and ones radiating, you can actually tell what's going on. So, for example, if I put down a smart dust through here and all the bits of smart dust that were trod on radiated a one, and all the bits of smart dust that weren't trodden on radiated a naught, you could know that somebody was walking across, and as John said before, you may be able to pull some gate information out of that. So we're going to go to the Internet of the Invisible. And then beyond that, what we're going to do with this data, algorithms, they are already determining what you see and don't see. And Ed Parris's book called The Filter Bubble, some people will have read, and there's currently some quite strong academic debate about the extent to which the filter bubble is actually putting a bubble around what you see and don't see. So I'm just going to make an assertion that some people are worried that your world, each of our worlds, is becoming quite self-referential. Because I look at this, I get to look at more of this. Because I don't look at that, I don't get to see much more of that anymore. We've been doing that for centuries, by the way. Some people buy the Dominion Post, some people will buy Hello magazine, some people will buy a business magazine. You know, we've already segmented ourselves a long time ago. It's the extent of the segmentation and the extent of the blinkering that goes on that actually matters. You know, the Facebook experiment of about a year ago was quite interesting, where they basically did some mood change experiments by upweighting and downweighting the kind of things you saw in your news feed to find out whether you reacted positively or negatively to the changes. So the question was, if we make the world around you look happier, will you be also happier, or will you be unhappy? You know, will you go with the flow or will you react? It was a useful experiment. Facebook is doing that all the time. The mistake was to call it an experiment and publish it as a research paper. We can already decide on your level of insurance based upon who your friends are in Facebook. And one of the delights of New Zealand is that adventure sports are insurance cost free because we have the Accident Compensation Corporation, so go down to Queenstown, break your neck, and that's just fine because somebody else will look after you. But don't have risky friends in other countries, because if you've got risky friends and they like doing all that sort of stuff, and they, you know, using the bungee jumping and they're jumping out of aeroplanes and they're climbing mountains, you will be deemed to be a riskier insurance proposition, and hence your premium goes up. So if I was you, I would go out of this stadium and I would go and have a look at my friend's profile and unfriend all those people who look like they lead an exciting life, because that will bring your insurance premiums down. You got that one for free. Where we're headed with the algorithms, you know, corporate and government surveillance, they now think Facebook, not the police, have got facial recognition to a point where it's better than human recognition by quite a margin and a lot faster. That's, you know, government surveillance. And the other one here is predictive policing. You know, in Minority Report, we had to have a quite artificial way in which there was prescience, because they hadn't thought it through to how do we get to know the future, but how they acted on the future is very close to now what is happening. That we're able to say, this is a more likely area for crime, we will surveil. You know, you talk to a black American versus a white American, and you will say they lead an entirely different life as a result of their skin colour. You know, even President Obama has said that you know, it's a very different life. Will this kind of predictive policing improve their lives, or will it make them worse? You know, there's some evidence that in fact their lives will get better because it provides better prediction than skin colour for are you likely to be a naughty boy. But you can understand why there might be concerns. There's a lot of watching going on, and who's watching the watchers, and that was part of the problem with Snowden. They at least had a case for doing some surveillance, but the extent to which they were doing their surveillance unsurveilled is at least part of the problem. Where we're headed with algorithms, manipulating preferences. As we heard before from John, there was the story of the ability of Target to predict if a woman was pregnant very early in the stages of pregnancy, and there's enormous economic value in knowing that, because there are times in everybody's lives when we change our behaviour and live the new behaviour for quite a long time afterwards, and starting a family is one of them. So that if we can pick that you're about to start a family, we're not just going to be able to flog you baby clothes for another 6 or 9 months. We're going to be able to, if we're smart, actually have you change your shopping patterns in our favour for a long time to come. So the value of a list that says these people are all pregnant or going to have a family is apparently tenfold per person, tenfold more valuable to sell than a list of just anybody in the population in terms of the return you can get from advertising. And this is again the same thing. There's now at least the first insurance company in America that will lower your health insurance premium if you can let them have a look at what all your wearables are saying about you in terms of the heart rates and the footsteps taken and all the other stuff. By the way, Woolworths in Australia is half owner of a company called Quantium. And Quantium has a lot of data from other sources, and Woolworths has loyalty card data. They ran the data together and they found that you are a greater car insurance risk if you eat red meat and drink red wine, that you're less of a car insurance risk if you drink white wine and eat pasta. So that's my second hint free of charge. Change how you eat before you next go for some car insurance, because you may be paying less. This is just correlation, no causality, just statistical correlation. But then there's, of course, and this is just a stark example that some people will already be aware of, Facebook came up with an app that would give you your year in review. And this is one of the responses to it was, the right thing happened to me, old boyfriend, apartment burnt down. This is the sad one. Very, very sad. This is a person who'd had a very unfortunate year. He got his year in review, and it included reminding him of his daughter's death by giving him a photograph of his daughter. It was just something he didn't want to have happen in his life. One of the interesting things that the algorithms can't, brackets yet, question mark brackets, do, is pick up on the sudden disjointed change in the circumstance of a person's life. So a child's death is one of those things that you can't pick up very easily, because what you're looking at in data often is trends of some sort. So with that, the pregnancy stuff that was being mentioned before was trend. One of the sad elements of that pregnancy story is many pregnancies end in miscarriage for perfectly good reasons, including the biology is setting out to have a good baby, not a bad baby, and a lot of miscarriages are natural for good reason and just always going to happen. But the system can't pick up on the miscarriage, so you may actually be heavily advertising on baby materials to somebody who's grieving through a recent miscarriage. So it's, again, how the data is used is very sensitive. But it's not all doom and gloom, and what I want to do is to put up for a moment a bit of optimism as to how we can go about this. And I'll give you 3 areas of thought to think about as to why, if we want to, as a society, we can reap the harvest. We can have a large amount of our cake, not all of it, because some of it perhaps we shouldn't be having, but a large amount of our cake and eat it too. Thinking about ethical frameworks, we heard the word ethics being mentioned by the Minister before, accountability and the law. So let's deal with ethical frameworks first. Let me think about how we might give you benefit in your company or your government agency from thinking about use of ethical frameworks. So this is a bit of a why bother slide. Think of all possible uses of the personal information that you've collected. And they do include some pretty ugly stuff, right out on the boundaries, the deceptive, the illegal, everything else. But let's go right to the core, at the opposite end. There are some uses of personal information that are so trivial that you've probably annoyed the individual by even asking them or telling them that you've got the information. Just get along with it. One of the examples might be, for example, fraud control. That you'd rather welcome the phone call from one of the credit cards that says there's an unusual activity on your credit card at the moment. Can you confirm for us a few facts about that transaction to find out whether, in fact, this transaction in Bermuda does relate to you or doesn't relate to you, and off you go. You don't even need permission for that one. You're pretty cool that somebody's actually looking after fraud done in your name. But then there's a bigger region of the basic use of information. Both the New Zealand privacy law and the Australian privacy law provide for a lot of collection and use of personal information simply by telling people that you're doing it. Not seeking permission, just telling people that you're doing it. There's another wider area, say in sensitive information such as health information and other information, where you really have to seek permission before you can do it. And this is where ethics comes into it. Is there a way in which we can build an ethical framework such that we're using the information in a way is not necessarily against the individual's interests, is considered to be ethical in a wider social sense, and I'm not saying what ethical is, I'm just saying there are some things that society may decide are generally ethical and some things that society may decide are generally unethical. Is there a way in which we can expand that feasible region where there's a responsible and accountable and an ethical use of the information, and we're doing it without asking? And if you're thinking about it, part of what we're trying to think about in the Data Futures Forum is essentially in that zone. And they're trying to write up some rules of the game that say, in the context of New Zealand, this will make it permissible for us to do, and we don't have to go out and ask everybody beforehand. There's a huge economic gain to be made if we can crack that one. And one of the reasons for using the word ethics rather than the law is that the law is deliberately a slow-moving beast. The only way law can be effective is if it is stable. Now, you really do see some quite fatuous arguments about the law can't keep up with technology, therefore the law has failed. I would suggest to you the law being stable is actually the best thing about the law, so let's make the law work through the dynamic world around it. Oh, by the way, that's a solved problem. We do it for motor cars already. We don't have Parliament-designed motor cars. Parliament just said you can't sell a motor car in New Zealand unless it meets a design standard. There shall be a design standards body and there shall be a standards testing body, and cars that have a piece of metal stapled to the front of the firewall, those are the only ones you're allowed to put on the road. Because saying that in the law there shall be a standard and only cars that meet standard is a stable statement that the law can enforce through time without changing much. The dynamics, which is what is a safe car today, can be dealt with away from the political arena more quickly than can be done in the political arena and keep on evolving motor cars. It's not as if we froze motor car design to solve that problem. We've done quite the opposite. I think we need to think about the same kind of builds for the handling of personal information. So credible decision-making processes and safeguards. And I suspect that governance is the key. Setting out to say what you're going to do, having mechanisms to get that delivered, having mechanisms to prove that you've delivered it, and learning from having done it. So let me talk about accountability as a part of this. What's really quite interesting is the OECD came out with the original 1980 guidelines that are still the fundamental basis for most comprehensive privacy laws around the world, including here in New Zealand. And when they did a refresh on it 2 or 3 years ago now, what was quite interesting was there was a huge discussion about shall we change the guidelines, the privacy principles themselves, and for various reasons, and I think some of them quite good, they weren't touched. But they did choose to change the emphasis on that, and including put a great deal more emphasis on accountability. In other words, not just saying this is what I'm going to do, but also the evidence that that's what you did do. And that's been one of the revolutions in thinking about how you handle personal information that's been going on around the world for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And the APEC cross-border privacy rules are achieving the same thing, an enormous emphasis on accountability, that you sign up to the cross-border privacy rule system, which is quite a job to go through in terms of getting through signing up with a trust mark agent, and then you have to go through an annual process that says, yes, you're still doing the right thing. And that allows for cross-border data flows that are considered to be more trustworthy than if you didn't. There's a Centre for Information Policy Leadership, which in fact really reignited the discussion about accountability as a way of making handling of personal information safer. Done remarkable work, and as you can see there's a clickable paper on accountability-based governance. And beyond that now we have a thing that basically is bringing it all together. The Information Accountability Foundation is actually working on a unified ethical frame for big data analytics. There's another organisation that I've been involved with called the Digital Enlightenment Forum, and its website is digitalenlightenment.org. And just in case that's too confusing, their blog is digitalenlightenmentforum.com. But they are just now thinking about what should be the ethical framework, basically from a European perspective. So it's starting right back with philosophical thinking and long words, but maybe they're going to get there too. But this business of ethics and the use of big data is going to be a big issue, I think. Now, I said the law. What's really quite interesting is this business of the stability of the law, but its application in the current circumstance. And there's a very, very interesting court case here called Vidal Hall versus Google, and that's the clickable link to read the decision. What's interesting about this decision is not that the words of the law changed, but that they read the law in today's circumstance and saw things a bit differently because of that. Now, I think some people weren't surprised by the decision, meaning, yeah, well, I thought that too. What's different is a high appeals court in Britain thinks that and has a very well-argued decision. One of the decisions that's a bit more controversial is the decision by the European Court of Justice, wrongly called the right to be forgotten. It's actually the right not to be indexed decision. That's actually, according to the lawyers, quite a poorly argued decision. In other words, it's difficult to actually work out how did they get there. This is allegedly very well argued and well worth reading. And they reinforced a broad definition of personal information. Remember what the Privacy Commissioner said? It's information about somebody who is identifiable. And it's not just, it's got to have the name, an address, an age, and a few other things attached to it before it's personal information. It's a whole lot of other things that may still, to use the word of this decision, individuate you, pick you out from the crowd. Whether you know the name or not is no longer the point. And what's also interesting is that it says a very large number of the world's devices now have only ever been in the hands of and controlled by one person for the whole of the life of that device. So I'll pick in particular on the MAC address of any mobile device, whether it's the Bluetooth MAC address or the Wi-Fi MAC address or any of the other MAC addresses that might be in that device. That MAC address is only ever going to exist on the life of this planet in that device. That device will only ever be controlled by one human being. And for many of the smaller mobile devices, that device will spend 90 to 95% of its life within 3 metres of that person's body. So wherever that device is wherever that person is, and let's not argue about it. So that then tells you an awful lot. Anybody who's loaded Google now will know how incredibly clever it is at working out in only a couple of days without you telling it where you live, where you work, how you get to work. And then you let it wander its way into other parts of your life, like your calendar and so forth. It gets richer and richer in the help that it gives you, and you tell it nothing. It's just got it all worked out. Malcolm, you better go home early tonight. There's going to be a traffic jam because everybody else's devices are jamming up and nothing's moving. How about leaving 2 hours early? I did nothing to be able to get told that. So this is, I think, read the law, the same words, but read them in a contemporary circumstance. And it's also, interestingly enough, broadened what it describes as harm, because a lot of the argument has been about harm has to be one way or another attached to dollars. This is basically saying there's a whole bunch of softer concepts that also can be harmful, and we read those as being part of the concept of harm that you're being protected from. And what to me is therefore quite interesting, here's a piece of law that is being read in a contemporary way to be very effective. Now, there's a lot more appeals to go on that one. That's actually an appeals court deciding on some certain matters of procedure before it's all remitted back to another court, I think a lower court, for then deciding in the context of that appeal, and then that court case will be then further appealed. So there's a long way to go on this court case, but it's a very, very interesting thing. So let me suggest to you this one. This is just the latest development, or nearly the latest development. All of these decisions are pointing in the same direction. Whether it's the Article 29 Working Party of all of the European Data Protection Commissioners in 2007, or it's the US Federal Trade Commission in its quite good report in 2012, or it's New South Wales Civil and Administrative Decisions Tribunal, or the fact that we actually had to pass a law in Australia to retain metadata and then agree it was in fact personal information after all, or during Privacy Awareness Week a little while ago, the Privacy Commissioner of Australia issuing a determination against our biggest telephone company saying, sorry guys, this person called Ben Grubb did ask for data that is personal information. The Privacy Act does apply to it. What's really quite interesting is how the argument has changed, by the way. It's only a year ago that policing in Australia was saying, quotes, it's only metadata and therefore we should have untrammelled access to it. There should not be any constraints on it or legal due process beforehand. A year later, they've turned around and essentially said the only data we're interested in is in the metadata. You know, we have to have the metadata. It has to be retained. We have to have access to it. So one of those two stories is true, but not both. The story has changed very rapidly. But this is a worldwide trend. None of those things, except for the data retention law, is a change of the law. It's an application of the law. And as I said, we're seeing that as well coming up. What is then interesting is a new development that's coming along with how do you apply risk management techniques to the management of personal information? There's nothing in life that allows you to reduce risk to zero. Everything that you do will involve risk in terms of a bad thing could happen with certain probability, and if a bad thing happens, how harmful has that bad event been? We're now seeing, again coming through the Centre for Information Policy Leadership, some thinking on how we can cleverly apply risk-based approaches to the handling of personal information, because that allows us to concentrate the resources where they're going to have most effect. But this is one thing that comes from that. As we move to new developments in government or in business, and we use the word agile more and more frequently, that actually means build, test, see if it succeeds and fail fast. That actually means by definition you're going to be making mistakes more often. What really matters in that circumstance, even more than the current circumstance, is given that the probability of something going wrong is a certainty, it's 100%, there is somebody going to get hurt besides your organisation in so doing. Have you thought about that person's experience and how you're going to alleviate that problem for them? Because here's the third little suggestion for free. If you can make an unpleasant event or a negative event less of that, or even turn it into a positive event, and we can give lots of little examples on how you can do that, then you can actually get social permission to make those kinds of mistakes more often. So you can actually be more agile, be more experimental, race out to the frontiers more often, because you're being given permission to make mistakes, because you've actually thought about how do we manage failure. Now, we have buildings with volatile and inflammable materials in them because we've put a lot of thought into the fire retardants and the safety mechanisms and the sprinklers in the roof and the evacuation procedures and so forth. We're living here in Wellington, which keeps on doing this all of the time because we thought more and more about how do we make it safer to be here. So we've now got to think about the same sort of thing for the handling of personal information. That's actually going to be the way in the future in which we're going to do much more things with personal information. Because at the moment, far too much of the discussion is on, let's stop bad things happening, and then we get frozen. Instead, if we think about the continuum between stopping bad things happening, detecting when bad things happen, and doing something good about when bad things happen, we can actually have a lot more fluidity in what we do. That, I think, is probably the golden key to how we're going to get this right in the future. Doesn't apply in all circumstances. If you're dead, you're dead. If they've chopped off your right leg when it should have been your left leg, there's not much you can do about it. But there's an awful lot in the handling of personal information that is reversible with effort. In amongst all of this, very quickly, identity management. You know, in at least some circumstances, we're only going to get privacy right if we get identity management right. We do still want to have certain circumstances where anonymity or pseudonymity or other mechanisms of being quiet work for you and work for the circumstance, but there will be many others when identity will matter. But it's a process of risk management. It's essentially about two entities. They could be animate, you and me. They could be animate and inanimate to me in a company, but it can actually be inanimate to inanimate, including in the Internet of Things. Being in touch with each other, making a decision, and it affects my life. You know, there's all sorts, but it's risk management. It's, will we allow these two things to interact? And therefore it involves some form of trust. And the thing that we forget all of the time, and I tried to reinforce in the last conference, is this has to be acceptable to both parties. So much of identity management is asymmetric. In the employer-employee relationship, that asymmetry may be appropriate. In terms of citizen leading normal life, often not appropriate. Data minimisation. Think about this. As we heard before in one of the talks, what is identity? Answer, we don't know. Next thing is, does it matter? No. Because identity is the wrong word for what we're doing here. What we're actually doing to solve the problem, reduce the risk, is exchange a claim about an attribute. In order to go to the pub, my claim has to be I'm over 18. In order for me to vote, in Australia, I have to prove that I'm an Australian. In order to get the baby bonus, except I was too damn old for it, I had to have had a baby after a certain date, but before another date. I had to be an Australian, and I had to be in Australia for all of those things, all of those attributes to hold before I got the baby bonus. But none of those were my name. None of those were an identity issue. They were other attributes that mattered. So when we're going to do identity management properly, it's going to be about the exchange of relevant attributes. And relevancy also relates to privacy, not just which bit matters. And remember, my birthday is not relevant for the pub. My age, over 18, is relevant for the pub. And if that attribute is verified by a third party, then it becomes more credible to the relying party. So relevant, verified attributes is the issue being, or the process being gone through to actually solve the problem of managing risk down so that it's acceptable to both parties. And the technology exists to do everything I've just said. We're not talking rocket science here. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So a couple of thoughts. As I said, only exchange relevant verified attributes, and I'm going to use some harsh language here to really re-emphasise what the Privacy Commissioner was saying, is we build this wrong and we create a digital god. In the sense of this digital god, which is the only thing that will allow me to have a digital existence, decides when I come into digital existence. This digital god, and there are no alternatives, decides when I cease to have digital existence. And thirdly, the metadata. Digital God watches everything I do between those two events. That's almost the biblical definition of a God. Okay? So how do we set up identity management processes or the exchange of relevant verified attributes that don't involve the digital God thing arising? Now, we have just had in Australia a government that has said, at our discretion, we're going to decide when you cease to be an Australian. Now, it's a very ugly event at which they claim they will make that decision, which is going off and, you know, joining some of these revolting terrorist activities. But they actually are saying, even if it makes you stateless, we don't care if you don't have any other citizenship. We'll just say you're not an Australian. Now, that's all very well and good. But it does actually then rest probably on the capriciousness of a minister. And even if the current ministry is the most trustworthy that Australia has ever had, that's not necessarily the case in the case of all future ministries. And, you know, the starkest example, to come back to the Privacy Commissioner's point, was why did more Jewish people die in the Netherlands than in France during World War II? It's not because of the Nazis. It's because the Dutch governments prior to the Nazis had better records. In other words, it was a trustworthy government that got the data, and it was an untrustworthy government that used the data. So, you know, we have to be very careful in the way we go through these things. We do have some very promising examples. We have in the audience, you know, some of the originators of the thinking of what's now called Real Me. Real Me's got some really good characteristics about it in terms of this business of trackability across domains and so forth. The US National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace has come up with trying to build a trust framework through a group of government and non-government interested people building an identity ecosystem, which actually recognises that government never has been, never will be, either a complete source of truth or a single source of truth or always getting it right. And one of the things that's quite surprising, even in countries like this one, is how many people have never had a birth certificate, never been registered as born. You know, and that's for starters, let alone any other problems that there might be. So how do we bring in all of the parties into the identity ecosystem who've got something to say or might want to make use of the data? There's a really interesting initiative in Britain called GovUK Verify, and they've just relet the contracts about a month ago, where there are 9 private sector groupings that are being contracted by the UK government to verify a person sufficiently for government purposes. So government's not doing it, the individual can. And because you've got 9 options, you've begun to dilute away somewhat the digital God problem because you have alternatives. And it's using private sector data to get there, of the have you been paying gas bills for 5 years variety, which is actually sometimes a much more useful way of working out whether somebody is worth dealing with than can I find their name. And we've got a very interesting system called MyGov, which has been on the life support system in various ways and reinvented and currently being reinvented and probably about to get reinvented again, but at least they're trying. And they really pumped it out this year because they said the only way you can do a personal tax return without a tax agent is to use MyGov, and that's popped it up to about 6 million users, probably for only one use per year in the case of many people. But again, MyGov has got a number of quite good characteristics in it that are taking out at least some of that digital God element, including less trackability. So we are seeing a number of well-qualified efforts around the world in actually dealing with some of these privacy issues. The gold standard, by the way, is ABC for Trust. That's a website, ABC, the numeral 4 Trust, abc4trust.eu. Go and have a look. The way that's set up is you can actually verify an attribute with the verifying party not knowing who the questioner was, who was asking the question, nor who was the question asked about. So the metadata is not even created, let alone not collected. It's a very interesting way of solving a problem. And I think more thought needs to be given to what they're doing. So to wind up, I think we can do privacy and identity well if we try. And some of that is actually the business of literally how we vote. Some of it is literally how we buy or how we interact with the world around us. And some of it is how we build and do things in the organisations that employ us, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector. There's an awful lot of decisioning to be done that will either have us doing things the right way or the wrong way. But it is going to involve collaboration. It is going to involve implementation, as I said, faster and faster implementation, learning by mistakes and fail fast, but in so doing, being held to account for what you do. And really, it's a golden rule. Deliver outstanding customer service in all circumstances, including when things go wrong. How many times does a supply chain pretend it's a single unit, a chain, while it's delivering, and then as soon as something goes wrong, all the links in the chain, that plural context concept, say, ooh, can't be us, talk to them. You know, there's no sense of helping you through a supply chain singular concept as things go wrong, and suddenly it's all fractured and gone. Supply chains in the future, I think, might even have to be required to behave in just a robust singular manner through moments of failure as they do through moments of success. In a commercial sense or a government sense, do that, manage well through failure, and you will gain the trust in a way that'll be very hard to replicate in the other way. And the last one is, as I said before, the law is working surprisingly better than you thought. so long as we can encourage the courts to think about the application of the law in the circumstances we're actually in now, rather than the circumstances as to when perhaps some of those laws were written. I hope, Miriam, that we've got plenty of time for questions. Like I've said before, I really hope there's somebody who disagrees with me, because then we've got a conversation. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.